Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So, inshallah, we want to start a series on Mahdiism, and the main focus is understanding the essence of Mahdiism from a Tawheedi angle. Unfortunately, when religion is, be it its rituals or its doctrine or its actions, when it's understood in a light Tawheed-lessly, when the ritual is seen for the sake of the ritual, or the doctrine for the sake of doctrine, or the action for the sake of action, minus Tawheed, that religion is going to be very minimum. And articles of doctrine have to be understood in the light of Tawheed. And if one evaluates one's doctrine carefully, one, if honest, may come to a conclusion whereby one says to oneself that there's no Tawheed in this article of faith which I am trying to incorporate inside my heart. And when there's no Tawheed, you can imagine what kind of an Islam would result. The same applies for rituals and actions. Rituals, doctrine, ethics, they all have to be traced back to Tawheed, not to anything else. They have to be traced back to Tawheed. Sometimes one may not understand it, that's okay. But one should, not understanding how things are traced back to Tawheed, one can compensate this lack of understanding by committing oneself to the doctrine, ethics and rituals of Islam because Allah has said so. That's a minimum understanding of Tawheed at least. You believe or you commit yourself to an action or an ethic because Allah has told you to do so. Naturally, with doctrine, we have to rationally understand it too. And the more we rationally understand it, that will facilitate the process of entrance into the heart. Doctrine enters your heart easier the more you understand it. Although in addition to understanding, there are other parameters which play a role, such as having sincerity, khulus, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we want to touch upon Mahdiism, and we want to try and dissect it and get to its core, but through a Tawheedi worldview. And so before we enter and speak about the personality of His Holiness, the 12th successor to the Holy Prophet, the Mahdi, we want to discuss a Tawheed initially. Then after we discuss Tawheed in a particular manner, and the approach I have adopted this time is different to previous lectures on Tawheed, slightly different. And then gradually we want to link Tawheed with Imamate, with successorship. And this link is very important. And that's how we have to see the 12th Imam, tracing his existence back to Tawheed and tracing Mahdiism in general back to Tawheed. But if we have a Tawheed-less understanding of these articles of faith, it's going to be very difficult. So that is our main approach here. Now, with Tawheed, the first thing we want to understand, and I've spoken a lot about Tawheed in other lectures, and you can refer to those playlists or lectures which I have given. But this time I want to start from a different angle of Tawheed even. And that's focusing on the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and creation. If in this sensible realm of existence, this physical realm which pertains to, let's say, the senses and what your senses can see, here, when you imagine any two things in this sensible realm, you can call them X and Y. We don't have to be specific for now. When, with any two given things, a question arises as, what is the relationship between them? How do they relate with one another? For example, imagine X is Peter, for example, and imagine Peter is Jane's cousin. Here, if you say Peter is identical to Jane's cousin, here the relationship between Peter and Jane's cousin is one of equality, is one of being identical to one another. You know, the equals sign in mathematics, if you add a third line to the equal sign, you have 3 lines. And they use that to say this is, X is exactly one and the same as Y. For example, when you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, you use the equal sign, 2 lines. But sometimes here you have 3 lines they use in mathematics saying that X and Y are exactly one and the same and are referring to the same reality. And here, Peter, with 3 lines, is one and the same, is identical to Jane's cousin. They're the same reality. So this is one form of relationship, and with this kind of relationship, all the attributes which are predicated on X, they're also predicated onto Y. Whatever's attributed to X will be attributed to Y equally, because it's the same application, it's the same reality. So here, this is one kind of relationship, and it's of being identical to one another. Another relationship is when X and Y are mutually exclusive to one another. And here, X can be Peter, Y can be Jane. And you say Peter and Jane, they're mutually exclusive because they're 2 independent entities. So here, unlike with the first relationship of being identical, where what can be attributed to X, the same is attributed to Y, this doesn't apply with 2 things which are mutually exclusive to one another. So what is attributed to Peter and what is attributed to Jane, it's different. So this is the second form of relationship. I want to go through the different relationships and then ask a very pertinent question. Another form of relationship is when X is a subset of Y. And the mathematical sign for subset, if you imagine the letter U and turn it 90 degrees rightwards, that's a sign meaning a subset of. So X is the relationship between X and Y, both being things which you sense with your five senses in the physical realm. Here, X is a subset of Y. Y being a set, X being an application of that set, of that group, of that collection. So for example, X, one example is Peter, and Y is a human population. Now it may be 10 people, 20 people, 1,000 people, but it's a group, a human group of people, a human population. Here, Peter is a subset of the human population. And here, naturally, X is not identical to the human population, but X is also not mutually exclusive to the human population. There's a commonality. They're not mutually exclusive entities here. It's a subset of Y. Here we say X is an application, or it's a part of a whole. Y is the whole, and X is one application, a part of Y. And that's why mathematically they use the term a subset of a set. So here Peter is an individual or an application or a subset of Y, which is a human population. Now, here, if there's no human population, if there's no Y, there'll be no X, because X was an application, a part of that whole. If there's no whole, then there's no X. If there's no human population, there's no Peter. And if there's no Peter, that group of people, or the human population, would become less, because there's no Peter now. See, this is the type of relationship here, when X is a subset of Y. Okay, now here we've discussed three different ways of relationship, of how two things in the realm pertaining to the five senses, how two things are related to one another. Are they identical to one another? Are they mutually exclusive to one another? Or is one a subset of the other? And these are three different relationships, and they're identified in this sensible realm. Now, after going through these three, the question that arises when we want to discuss Tawheed is, what is the relationship between us, created beings, between man and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is it one of these three? If so, why? And if it isn't, why not? And if it's neither of these three, what kind of relationship is it? This has to be explored. So we'll end here, and if you digest it, and inshallah in the next session we'll go a bit deeper. وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين.